Dobro večer svima, lijepo vas je vidjeti u velikom broju. Jako sam sretna što je s nama ponovo u malo zapravo vremena je prošlo od njenog zadnjeg dolaska u Zagreb Kumjana Novakova. Ovdje je bila s nama također u Dokukinu u sklopu projekta Kritika i društvo Hrvatskog društva filmskih kritičara. A evo sad je ovdje s nama na poziv Restarta i održat će Masterclass UZ ARHIVE nasuprot arhivima, sastavljanje odsutnosti, gdje će se fokusirati zapravo na svoj rad s arhivima kroz primjere svojih dvaju filmova i video eseja Disturbed Earth i Silence of Reason. Kumjana će također uz Masterclass paralelno voditi i Ravkat radionicu za polaznike škole dokumentarnog filma koji su također ovdje s nama. I eto, ne bih previše duljila, prepustila bih riječ Kumjani i samo bih napomenula da nakon predavanja će također biti i projekcija njenog forenzičnog video eseja Šutnje razuma. Između ćemo imati kratku pauzu od 10 minuta i to je to. Evo, možemo krenuti. Hvala vam.
Dobro večer svima. Prije svega hvala Dini i Hrvoslavi na pozivu, hvala Restartu. Jako mi je drago da sam u Zagrebu u tako kratkom vremenu. Mislim da je jako važno održavati veze i raditi na vezama. I pored svih mogućih kontraargumenata za korištenje engleskog jezika, ja bih išla ipak na engleskom. Iz razloga što dolazim iz jednog vrlo kaotičnog perioda i vjerujte, ne želite da me slušate sa konfuznim terminima na našim jezicima. Tako da, eto, izvinjenje, kritike stoje, ali idemo na engleskom. So, for the ones who, I guess most of the people who honored me and all of us with their presence don't know much about my work. So I will start with a very kind of general and brief introduction before to dive into some of the principles that I believe can be considered interesting or important to discuss, all of us together. And just before to introduce myself, I would like to ask you to feel fully invited to take this as a talk, as an exchange, and as a conversation. I think that the term masterclass is quite problematic in itself, and I would really like not to frame this encounter as any class, let alone a masterclass. So I'm a filmmaker currently, but I think important for the sake of this talk is to share that my background is in research methodologies. I have spent most of my higher education thinking and studying different possibilities in uncovering or researching social phenomena. I have been staying with a lot of qualitative and quantitative methodologies in social sciences, and I think this is one of the most important kind of aspects that shapes my film work. Another aspect that I would like to share with you, and maybe you can have in mind while we discuss later on, is the space from which I try to act, both as a filmmaker and as a human being, as a woman. And that is our region, our common region. I believe that all of the kind of divisions and national identities are imposed on us, so I truly consider myself someone who is at home all over what used to be a common state. It's not anymore, Yugoslavia. So all of my kind of frame of thinking and conceiving cinema, let's say, departs from this proposal. Once the wars finished, few years after, and when I say the wars, I mean the 1995 wars all over former Yugoslavia, I moved from Macedonia, where I was born, to Sarajevo, and I lived from 2001 until 3 years ago in Sarajevo, almost uninterrupted. And this is the third principle that, let's say, determines my point of view and my departure. Sarajevo is an extremely complex space, and Bosnia is even more complex. But at the same time, it's also a space that allows both for researchers and for artists to discover and develop imagination and imaginative principles, no? So these are the three, let's say, biographical points that I would like to share with you before we start. Dina already introduced that most of the time I will speak about the archives and work with archives and what can make an archive a space of creation and knowledge. But at the same time, I would like to kind of invite you to think about archives as living spaces and to forget or to throw away the idea that archive is a space of history. So when I will use the term archive, I really think about a place where different kind of experiences are gathered, and an archive can be anything where multiplicities of existences are present or are coexistent, no? And from this point of view of an archive, I would like to first start with an encounter that I came across in quite a formal archive, in an archive which is governed and organized by the International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. I believe that this is a place where the ICTY is equally known as it's the case with Bosnia or with Kosovo, so I don't need to make an introduction. But I want to say that few years ago, I started thinking about a project that would potentially try to work through the identity of the contemporary female in our spaces and to kind of unmask what politically makes a female in our space. And when I started thinking about this idea, of course, one of the most difficult and challenging issues was the presence of, first, gender-based violence, which then took me to the very instrument of gender-based violence during the wars, which is sexual violence and rape. And when I started thinking about this project, having the experience of research and work with kind of non-conventional methodologies for film, I thought, okay, let's go to the ICTY and see if there is something which can propose what is the scope and what are the mechanisms that have been shaping us women and men in our region in this respect. And this is the point that I would like to share with you. We can pass it on. The first document that I found in this enormous archive, which gathers, which is first of all fully open. Anyone with an address anywhere can simply subscribe for free and start browsing and researching the archive. All of the documents archiving all of the crimes committed from 1990 and 1991 up to the end of 2001 with the last conflict on the territory of former Yugoslavia is present there. It's inside of this archive. So anyone can, for himself, herself, themselves, access this archive. So I used this open access. I started researching and I came across, I started researching for sexual violence and mechanisms that were developed by the militaries throughout former Yugoslavia that were including rape as a weapon of war. And this document that I share with you was one of the first documents. It's a personal testimony of a woman whose court code name is 87 and who during the war was, when the war started, she was 13 years old, and when the war ended she was 17 years old, which is more or less, not more or less, but exactly my age. And with all of my interest before in the, let's say, female experience during the war and after the war, in this testimony there were aspects that I never heard before. These aspects included enslavement, included trafficking, and included trafficking not by what many expect of international military personnel present in the region, but by our own militaries, trafficking in countries that and in spaces which we considered to be not involved in the war, like Montenegro. So for me, this element that was on top of all of the known facts from before the war was a full kind of, I don't want to say shock, but it really shifted the way I started looking at the experience of the female experience of the war, but which is most important, the female experience of the present. It was a proposal that we today are building upon experiences which are pure violence, and it's somehow translated as if it was a moment of realization that my body is a body of violence. But I want to go back to the archives. So one of the first kind of archival entrances to the project, which was supposed to be a film, was this document of a lot of pages, text only, pure transcript. And then my initial response, having in mind the emotional but also the research ideas, took me to trying to take a distance and not to think about it as a film project. It's a kind of an impossibility, no? You cannot continue to think of certain material that you come across as a film project if it is a court transcript of hundreds and hundreds of pages of text. So it took me to the proposal that I should take a distance and maybe try to continue the research outside of the archive of the court. The next element that I encountered in this research outside of the court archive was a book of short stories that was written a few years after the war by a writer that I'm sure it's very well known in this city. I will not give the name. It would be interesting to simply go through the process together, but I want to share a very short selection, let's say, or reassemblage, my own reassemblage of a short story by her. We will try to be a bit theatrical. And maybe we can take off the light. I don't remember her face, or even if I saw it at all. It was probably blurred. Many women who testified in the Foča case were protected from the public by a screen. Their faces and sometimes their voices were distorted. But I do remember her voice, or the lack of it. This woman came to the tribunal as a witness in the Foča case, but when her turn came, she could not speak. She sat facing Kovač, the man who had raped her daughter, imprisoned her, and finally sold her to a Montenegrin soldier for some 500 German marks. She had last seen her child boarding a bus that was taking people away from Foča. Years passed, the war ended, but her daughter never came back. Now the woman looked at Kovač, but the words did not come. As if someone's hand were squeezing her throat. She tried, you could see that she tried very hard to speak, but all she could let out was a tiny sound. In the courtroom, the prosecutor showed her a photo of her daughter, called AB in the court, and asked how old she was when the photo was taken. Instead of giving an answer, the mother cried. But it was not really a cry. It sounded as if there were a microphone inside her belly and you could hear the sobs tearing her apart. It didn't last for more than half a minute, that deep whining sound, as of an animal so wounded that there was no sound it could make. To listen to that voice was unbearable. I can't stand a dog wailing, much less a human being. There is no greater pain in this world than to lose a child. And she had to sit in front of Kovač and talk about it. And the pain overwhelmed her. The mother and the young girl Abby was one of some 30 women who took the floor as a witness against the rapists from Foča. They were nameless women, referred to as FWS 87, 191, 50, 51, 75. In being denied a name, or perhaps in refusing to give one, they represent all the other girls who follow in their path. Anonymity enables her to stand in for all the others. A court usher would roll down a plastic yellow curtain over a part of black robes with purple-red colors, sterile formal atmosphere, the foreign languages that the participants spoke. On a TV screen in the courtroom, women's faces would be obscured, their voices distorted. They sounded mechanic, almost metallic. But the defendants could see them face to face. The rapists from Foggia probably never imagined their victims would confront them in a courtroom. They knew women don't speak about their shame, especially not Muslim women. This time, they were wrong. And maybe now we can go back with the light. I would like first to ask if someone recognized the text. Maybe an idea. I can help. It's a local writer. Local, like really local. I don't want to use national identity as an orientation, but let's say really local. It's Slavenka Drakulić. It's her work, They Wouldn't Hurt a Fly, and it's a collection of short stories that she wrote during the first 4 years of the court, following 5 court cases and resulting with one short personal essay coming out of each of the court cases. And I wanted to share this for many, many reasons, but I will stop in few. First one is that facing a literary work that translated in a way accessible for all of us, an archive that would be otherwise being completely inaccessible, not only because the archive is painful and uninviting for any of us, but also because it's geographically distanced from us, it's in an international institution, and rarely who of us would like to spend any kind of research work there. So for me, it was an encounter with this artwork that was re-archiving this inaccessible archive and trying to bridge the inaccessibility of our collective memories, which are taken away from us, in a completely accessible way. This is a very strong proposal, I think. But on a more personal level, and also in a filmmaking, let's say, from a filmmaking perspective, this encounter for me was a revelation that archive, any kind of archive, can become filmic if we find a way of transforming it into imaginative tools that can create images without necessarily finding images literally, no? So if she could create out of a process of a trial, a work that fully transcended me and made me see and feel and get so close to a very particular experience, it meant that we can also do it in cinema. And somehow, to be super straightforward and direct, it pushed me to think about the transcript as the beginning of an image. And then the third and last encounter, and then I will maybe talk a bit more about the kind of entrance into the film development, was made after the short story of Slavenka Drakulic. So with all of this that I said, I returned to ICTY and I continued researching, and I found a photo. And maybe we can show the photo. So I don't know how do you feel about this photo, but for me, the first time that I saw it, I was fully impressed. It's a photo made in the 90s. It's obviously composed of 4 photos in order to establish a space. But then, while it establishes a very broad and open space, it also suggests that it's someone's point of view. In the left corner, in the down corner, it says view from the balcony number 1. And then the second layer is that it looks like it's the middle of the day, but it's almost emptied of human presence, no? We cannot really see people on the streets, but there are cars. We cannot really see people on the streets, but then it's not really that we are looking at physical destruction. And one can say, well, okay, maybe it's Sunday, but maybe it's not Sunday. In other words, this kind of, all of these possibilities as proposals that I'm sharing created, let's say, a tension between me and the photo, and created a desire to understand more and to go further. So the very automatic, if you want, gesture is to start analyzing the photo, no? And to go deeper or to zoom in. This is what we do when we don't know and we cannot see what is far from us. We start to zoom in. So I started zooming in and zooming in and zooming in, and then I found someone. And yes, maybe it's better. We can go with the clip. And we can go with lights off. Yes, thank you. this comprises, in a way, the three, let's say, not only initial, but most important elements that started to form a work, a film work, but also a position, an entrance point, not only for a possible film, but also for understanding how do I enter, or how can I enter this experience of coming from generations and generations of women who have been subjected to violence and whose bodies are archives of violence. Why? Because, and we can discuss many aspects, but I want to stay with one thing. My initial response to this third element and the photo and the woman was, I wrote immediately a message to a friend and one of the best editors that happens to honor me to work with me, Maxa, that probably some of you met, and she was also last year here doing what I'm doing now. I sent her a message and I told her, look at this photo. This is, we stand at the window. This is us. And this was really not a deeply thought message. No, it was my very instinctive reaction to the woman that is standing on the opposite of someone who is looking through a balcony of a potential space of crime, because it's a photo which is governed by the ICTY and which comes from a trial against rape of women. So suddenly we see this photo of a woman who is returning the gaze and who probably was witnessing what is going on. And I'm sharing this because I think that this crystallized in a way the idea that the entrance to this kind of space can only be through a point of view that is trying to get as close as possible to what is going on, but will never be inside. It's a position that we cannot go inside, no? And somehow this figure of the material witness became the narrative tool to enter further the archive that was extremely difficult to work with because it was legal. At the same time, if it was not for the text of Slavenka Drakulić, this witness could be very distanced, because in the image it is a kind of a very obscure, no, it can be an obscure neutral position. But combined or shaping my own entrance to the research space through Slavenka Drakulić essay, it meant that this witness is very close to the survivor, because Slavenka shares almost as if she is sitting next to the mother who is giving the testimony. She never takes the role and she never writes about the mother, but she's close, sitting almost next to her, no? So this created a very kind of basic, let's say, entrance, which in some projects it's very difficult to, in most of the film projects it's very difficult to achieve, no? In the sense that we can be working and not really have the luck of coming across this kind of strong encounters that can shape our entrance to the way that the film can unroll or start. But yeah, so I think that in some way with certain projects they find their way to articulate themselves for us, because most of the time what the work with the archives require is not to search, but to look and to listen, to just be present, and to allow for the archives and for the encounters to make us and to form us, and not the other way around. Because very often, especially in working with difficult historical, social, political issues, we are trying to find, it's very human also to try to find an answer. And we think of archives as illustrating ideas. And this can be extremely problematic, politically, socially, culturally, but at the same time is quite non-creative, let's say. I can only say, I can only add to this on the political aspect of it. I think for me it's very important why it's politically problematic, because archives as such are never neutral, no? Archives are products of a certain, of different systems, of different hierarchies, and of different presupposed relationships. And as such, they translate all of these relationships in their resonances. So if we are trying to search for an answer, we will always find the answer of the system. However, if we sit with them only in the same room, and if we are open and simply look, then there is a possibility that not only the artifacts, but also the erasures and the invisibilities will talk to us. Like this woman, which is absolutely invisible when you see the image. When I opened the image on the computer, I couldn't see that there was a material witness, and this witness is a woman looking bravely outside of her window. She's not hiding, she's not behind the curtain, she is fully exposed. And I think that this is maybe a very practical kind of, I don't know, maybe even banalizing example of what an invisibility in the archive means. But these invisibilities are where our possibilities are, where our chances are for facing not only hidden and erased presences, but also subjects that can suddenly make parts of life and time become different in the present. So they have the potential to change the way we are in the present, because by providing the possibility to see at the past differently, we can see the present differently. Okay, I want to stop a bit and just maybe get your immediate questions, or simply, I don't know, comments and... and it can be anything that comes to your mind from what I was sharing. Huh? We don't have to. Yeah. Evo ga. Okay.
Okay, jedan, dobro. So thank you so much. For me, it's really, really, really great and useful to listen to your experience with the archives, because I watched the film. I find it really moving and beautiful, and one of the best things I saw in the last few years. But what I wanted to ask you is, you said in the beginning that in the archives multiplicities coexist. So if you can share with us, when did you run across one of these multiplicities, and how did you then choose what side or what view or what detail you took from the archives? In maybe if you have some specific case, which I think is very, very interesting, especially when you say that you need to look for the invisibilities and presences which can shape the day we are working in. And then the second is a little bit more prosaic. Is when you work with the archives, what do you think about the context, about the quantity of the context you need to provide for the viewer, or do you just let him, you know, I don't know how to phrase it properly, but there is an image. So do I use the image, or do I use the context of the image in a certain thing? Or of course you can work with both. But if you had these doubts in your work, I would really like to hear something about it. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Damir, for bringing this. And it's also probably the most important aspect of archives, of working with archives, your first question. And yeah, we will go in this direction anyway after, but it's an amazing to start there. So I think the core of, or the, let's say, biggest part of the work for the film was precisely in translating the position that I was talking about into a guiding force for finding one of the many multiplicities of the archive that is as close as possible to our own political position. What did it mean? If you look at the transcript that I was shared, it's very much representative of which is the one of the many multiplicities of the archive that is the power who organizes the archive. This is the court process, which is organized around the idea of proving the violence. So the primary power, or the primary subject, if you want, of the archive is the perpetrator. Everything is organized around his existence, his actions, his doings, and so on. Meaning, when we enter the archive, this is an archive of violence. While our position is resistance, and it's counter-violence, and it's subverting the whole process towards the ones not who perpetrated the crimes, but who survived the crimes and who are the basis of our collective survival, if you want. So the first thing of working with this archive was to re-archive it in a way that is organized not around the crime, but around the survival. Therefore, the one subject that we needed out of the many multiple coexisting there, which besides the perpetrator and the survivor, were also the court system, the prosecutor, the judge, and these are all aspects that are fully visible and much more easier to access than the survivor. So so the question, which is the subject to work with in the multiplicity, was actually, we knew that this is the survivor, but how to find the survivor? And this sounds very simple when you hear it. You would say naturally, of course, it's the, to use the commonly accepted word, it's not survivor, it's victim. You would say, of course, these are the victims who will come and testify. But this is not really easy to be done, because if you try to search a court archive, you can never find through a simple search the statement of the witnesses, because the archive is not organized by the statement of the witnesses. It's organized by the days of the hearings, and the days of the hearings can involve any kind of procedures. And out of, if usually the hack cases, in the best case, they lasted around 1 year. Once they start, I don't talk about the preparations, I talk from the start of the hearing until the judgment is done. In 1 year, you can have around 2 or 3 hearings per month. So this makes, let's say, in the best case, 24, in the worst case, 48 hearings with thousands of pages of material that is absolutely incomprehensible for a person who is not a lawyer. And the witnesses are not presented as witnesses, but as, for example, FIVIES 87. For a person who comes from the outside, it means nothing. Meaning, to go back to your question, in order to find the witness or the subject, I started a process of first understanding the court case from the outside of the archive, reading legal works that have been done around the case, legal analysis and so on, and places where I could decipher how they were working and what was going on. And this research led me to the finding that there were several factors which supported the possibility to have quite a lot women witnesses. Out of 80 women who were identified by the prosecutor investigative team that were subjected to rape and sexual violence and trafficking, almost 30 of them testified in the hack. So I knew that inside of these hearings, we can reconstruct the testimonies of almost 30 women. And then I started reading day by day, and then I started being able to read faster because you slowly start to understand the legal procedures. But the first line of work was to detect, to identify all the code names of the witnesses and to start establishing their personal trajectory from May 8 in the case of Foča. The beginning is May 8, 1992, when Foča falls under the arrest paramilitary, and up to now. This is problematic. In duration of 8 months, the military establishes 7 locations, more or less, which are used as rape camps, specialized concentration camps for rape of women. But then after February, there is few young women who are enslaved and they are trafficked to Montenegro. So the last point of, let's say, liberation of women is almost by the end of 1993. So I reconstructed almost 30 women and their personal trajectories in duration of either 8 or 12 months. 4 months were the last two girls kept in enslavement in Podgorica. And the biggest challenge, now again going back to the creation of the subject or the allowance for the archive to find the subject that I would like to stay with, was to protect ourselves, me and all of the women with whom I worked on the project, Maxa and Zelen, the graphic designer, and a feminist friend, male, the sound designer. For us, the biggest challenge was to reject the magical attraction to the violence. And I say this term, I use this term, magical attraction, with full responsibility here. Because what we have been trained in education, in culture, in public space, is to search for the excess and for the violent act, and not for the survival. So we get extremely attracted to read on what were the violences committed and not how was the defense from these violences, or what was other than the violent existence of these women. In other words, even though we knew that our subjects are women, the women, and we need to stay with them, we could not really easily disregard any of the material that was coming from the power of the archive, meaning the defense. Why? Because these are materials that can establish a film immediately. Imagine audio clip of Mladic announcing that Foča is now Serb and completely clearing up all of the questions that you might have. Where are you? In which city you are? What is going on? How it's going on? And so on. From a filmmaker's perspective, this kind of material works for itself. You don't have to do anything. You put it, and we are all in Foča. We know that there is the Serb military there. We know that the war has started, and so on and so forth. And I'm not making an kind of speculative proposal here. One of the first clips that I found was a radio statement interview with Mladic, in which he says, because Foča is so patriotic, we didn't have to do a lot of things in order to conquer it. It was already ours because the locals did all the work for us. Because really from the outside, Foča was one of the cases where Serb military didn't have to come from the outside. It was taken from within. And I remember editing myself a small work because it was a point that I was preparing an application for funding for art grant, and I needed something to show. And I was editing and editing and editing and listening to this voice, and I couldn't believe, why am I listening to fucking Mladic alone in my room and allowing him to enter my home? If this is someone who destroyed all of us because we could not protect ourselves of not entering our homes in the 90s, why am I still doing that? Why should I, in 2021, 2, 3, 4, allow him to enter my home? What could be a possible reason to give him life inside of my film? There is no reason for this. And this was a very strong moment in which the idea of the language was born. We will not use any of the materials which comes from the perpetrators, no matter how important they are for achieving our line of sharing the experience of survival. So it was a very rigid methodological decision that proposed that the rule is to speak with a language that is unknown, because our space is formed by the language of violence, and this is the language which is known. But this proposal then translated that, okay, so we are creating a language from everything which is not the violence, meaning that suddenly a full revelation came that if you take away the subject who is committing the violence, everything which stays, no matter what it is, if it's an sound resonance, an echo, an empty sound, an empty image, it belongs to the survivor. And suddenly we understood that what we are searching for is the missing image, is the missing sound, because the ones that are there are of the violent, are of the authority, if you want. And this is a perfect connection to the next clip, because it will reinforce what I'm explaining, and then I will go back to your second question, if that's fine. Okay, so we can go with the next clip, thanks.
to soba namijenjena za spavanje, sa 2 kreveta, možda nekom natpasom, ormar, prava soba za spavanje. Sigurno znam da je imao pištolj, da li nešto više, ovog se trenutka ne mogu sjetiti. Govorio je uglavnom stvari pa čega se plašim, pa zar ja ne znam šta je to seks, zar ja to nisam prije radila, uglavnom tako da uživamo takve stvari.
Yes, so this part of the film can serve to now dig further what it meant to work with the echoes of all recreating the position of the women survivors. It meant that the text had to become an image, because here I was trying to get a clip in which you can see all the different elements that we were using, but to be open with all of you fully and to fully uncover the decisions, these elements were very disbalanced, in the sense that the text that we had was, as I said, more than 10,000 pages, around 13,000, 14,000 of pages, which then became much less, but still the moment that we entered inside of the editing room, and this is a project which is fully made inside of the editing room, the pages of text for each survivor was absolutely crazy. To that level that when Maxa saw it, her first comment was, you know that people go to cinema because they don't like to read or to take rest from reading. But we both were clear and we knew that we have to we have to find a way, of course, to cut the text a lot, but we have to find a way to translate text into image. Otherwise, we didn't have anything, because the other elements that we had were 6 audio clips, the longest one being around 45-50 seconds, that were original audio clips of the witnessing of the women. Because one of the aspects that maybe I should immediately share is that we know this court is international and the official languages of the court are English and French. So what they do for the archive is they archive the full process through the transcripts of the translations of all of the statements in English and French, where the original recordings of the hearings in our languages are deleted. The archive doesn't have, the court doesn't have a budget to, or they say that they don't have a budget to organize such a huge archive. So the few clips that we could find were luckily used by the outreach office of the court to promote their work in bringing transitional justice to our countries. So we had these 6 audio clips. The audiovisual material was coming from the forensic team, because we decided we will not use perpetrators' material. So the only visual material we had was from the forensic team and the researchers who were trying to prove the strategy of using rape as a war crime and crime against humanity. And there was really a very special, let's say, coincidence, an international kind of support for the women who survived sexual violence, was lobbying in the ICTY to take the Foča case as early as possible, while still the crimes could be really researched on the ground. So this forensic team arrived right after the war finished in '96, and they started the research process, and they were taking photos and short video of all of the locations where women were enslaved. And okay, it sounds very exciting, but in practical terms, that was about 35-40 minutes of video and photography of each of the location, sometimes 20 photos of a location, sometimes only 1 photo of a location. And finally, there was the element of citizens' audiovisual entrances. When the court started working, they were calling upon people who have any kind of audiovisual material from before the war or after the war that they consider could be used in the court for pushing forward any court case, that they should donate. And we found a very special home video of someone who was amateur videographer, who donated the material to show that Foča before the war was a normal place. So we had the grounding of the view of the one who is with us in a way politically, and who was setting up the space from before the crimes. And then finally, the last elements were of citizens who were remembering the beginnings of the war and how they were perceiving the entrance, and who were by coincidence, not by coincidence, but by really the luck that we were in a way starting to be digitally and visually interested in the 80s. They were recording the TV programs on VHS tapes of different kind of stuff, And then after the war, when they saw this call from the FOCHA, from the ICTY, they were remembering, checking, and finding TV shows maybe that would be in some part of the VHS that would prove the military intentions. So we had few interviews on different local TV channels of Republika Srpska, where you would have this kind of guests who would prove that they're liberating the space and so on, which for us was completely uninteresting because it was belonging to the other side. But then, if you think about the concept that I was suggesting, meaning the absences and the resonances of what stays if you take out the image of the perpetrator becomes the image of the survivor. So we came to the idea and we started working with this VHS glitch, because without the image on it of the other, it became the image of us, the ones who were remaining there. Maybe this sounds a bit abstract. I can give you another example of a work that is maybe more straightforward, from where, let's say, it's easier to get to the methodology. For example, there is a South American artist who was researching the archives related to lynching in US in the mid 1800s, when the white dominant population had the habit of publicly lynching black people, photographing the lynching, and then creating postcards of the lynching and selling them as if they are souvenirs of a celebration of a victory. So he was interested in uncovering the basis of this violence as a founding factor of the United States nowadays. So he traced and found all of the postcards that were created in these kinds of events and that were circulated through the postal office as postcards. But the intervention that he did was because he wanted to show the violence and not the violated. He intervened in the image and he took away the bodies of the lynched. So suddenly this image became an image, a portrait of the violator. No? Because what we see are only the ones who are committing the crime, and suddenly this image became not the image of the one who is suffering, but a mirror image of you as a violator. No? And this is for this work I discovered a few months ago, and for me it became absolutely interesting to see a resonance of what our kind of principle was, and I find it, yeah, it's inspiring for me. I hope it's inspiring for you also. But I think it portrays very clear what we were trying to do and how we arrived to this idea of which is the image out of all of the multiplicities that will get as close as possible to this, to our subject, the survivor, that was denied the right to an image. And maybe I stop and I get immediate maybe questions or comments on this. I hope I'm not too abstract. Or you can ask me anything related to the clip that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Super.
Hi, so I haven't seen the movie, but I'm also dealing with gendered violence and sexual harassment in the film community, and I've done a movie about it. I'm wondering, have you thought about, I haven't seen the movie, but through the process of fetishizing the victims, and how did you deal with that? Because you told us that you were only, and what we saw from the clips, only saw the violence and their interpretation of their violence. So did you thought about that?
Thank you so much. Very important, of course. I think basic aspect. I can be very general and gentle, and I can also be very radical. I will try to present as much as many as possible of my concerns, and then we can maybe think together if and how they can work to solve this problem. One of the first decision, which I hope politically took us closer to the survivors. I'm not using the term victim, I refuse, but I want to say that what I mean when I say survivor is the same as what you mean. So the first decision that was kind of hopefully in some terms resolving this problem was not to give voice to the perpetrator, to create a space that only speaks through the voice of the women. And this, on one side, is a position that is closer to them, but on the other side, it can create the problem that you are talking about from a different kind of perspective, no? Because somehow the voice that they had in the trial was to prove the violation. So what we could get is again a description of the violence in most of the cases. So the second proposal, in order to get us closer, was to try and detect as much as possible personal information from what was presented, unrelated to the crime. And to try, by this personal information, to create their characters, or not to create, but to make us be able to see them, because they are already there. We are not creating anything. So I started reading again from scratch only the introductions of the testimonies, because it is there where the biographical information is established. And suddenly we could see them as women outside of the crime. I was a doctor, I had 30 years, I was 30 years old when the war started. My apartment was just on the opposite of the hospital. My husband was working in a high school. And this allows for a space which is outside of the crime and gets us closer to all of the personalities. But then, really, I think the crucial decision, and we can, of course, debate around it, was to accept what they agreed to be public information and to work only with the information that they have provided to the court and that they signed, that can be used for any kind of research. Meaning, it meant that researching who are the survivors, where they are, how they live, could not be done. Because for us, it meant that we are entering personal space only because we encountered them as survivors of sexual violence. We didn't meet by coincidence, but the film was supposed to be the reason to get to them, which is one of the most horrible reasons to enter someone who went through this kind of experience, to enter her life, no? So, but then beside this principle, it also meant that we will work with the code names that they agreed upon. We will work with the information that they considered to be public, because there is a lot of information that is redacted and you can request, and then maybe if you have a reason good enough, the court can open for you also redacted information. So we decided that if they agreed only to this, we will use only this. And that meant to have sometimes a testimony which goes, and then suddenly there are 3 blank pages. And it's written, this page is closed for public. It's protected. So it's to accept what the wish of the one who testifies is. But of course, this is all not enough, because you can still create an image which is extremely violent, and it doesn't mean that if we had all these principles, the film will be taking care of the integrity of the survivor. And this is something that it's a risk that every filmmaker has to live with. It meant to balance in the final decision on each of the statements that entered in the film, and that was the most difficult part. Sometimes, even though some of the statements would have given a more complete image of how was this particular strategy used, we were not leaving them because we felt that it is too much, because it was given inside of a very specific situation. It was given because they knew that they will contribute to the collective good, and they will probably succeed to prove that what was going on was not an individual punishment, but it was a military strategy. But on the other hand, we are not the court, no? So sometimes, even though certain testimonies were much stronger than the ones you see, and you can, when you watch the film, you can think that is unimaginable, but believe me, it is. We didn't use. However, the bigger problem started when we started discussing what if we are entering from a different point inside of the film, and if we are to face the whole climate of denial. Because, as you know, our spaces still have voices which deny that this happened. So if you do not give enough elements that are establishing the facts, you always leave the possibility that the experiences can be denied. So this is where the nightmare was, to balance in between them not to be questioned, because as you might imagine, the worst violence ever to a survivor is to question if the violence really happened. And we as women have to deal with this on a daily basis. it's the only crime in humanity which has to be proved, not how it happened, but that happened first, and then how. So the balance was all the time in between, never to be questioned, and at the same time to be with them and to be as respectful as possible to their decisions and their choices and their personalities and so on. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there is a right or wrong, you know, but I'm checking the time and we are not very, very good. But I think this is the moment, speaking of this, to close with something which goes in this direction. And this is the work of a writer and theoretician and a filmmaker that I really admire, and who is somehow able to articulate this difficulty of how to negotiate and how to find a way to sleep with the choices and the decisions made in works like this. I will read 3 elements and then we can close maybe all together. Through the notion of poetic language, I'm certainly not referring to the poetic as the site for the consolidation of a subjectivity or as an aestheticized practice of language. Rather, I'm referring to the fact that language is fundamentally reflexive, and only in poetic language can one deal with meaning in a revolutionary way. For the nature of poetry is to offer meaning in such a way that it can never end with what is said or shown, destabilizing thereby the speaking subject and exposing the fiction of all rationalization. Barthes astutely summed up this situation when he remarked that the real antonym of the poetic is not the prosaic, but the stereotyped. Such a statement is all the more perceptive as the stereotyped is not a false representation, but rather an arrested representation of a changing reality. So to avoid merely falling into this pervasive world of the stereotyped and the cliched, filmmaking has all to gain when conceived as a performance that engages as well as questions its own language. However, since the ideology of what constitutes clarity and accessibility continues to be largely taken for granted, poetic practice can be difficult to a number of viewers, because in mainstream films and media, our ability to play with meanings other than the literal ones that pervade our visual and aural environment is rarely solicited. The second point that relates is very short. Everything I criticize in one film can be taken up again and used differently in another film. There is no need to censor ourselves in what we can do. And finally, the last. There is a link between speaking nearby and indirect language. In other words, a speaking that does not objectify does not point to an object as if it is distant from the speaking subject or absent from the speaking place. A speaking that reflects on itself and can come very close to a subject without, however, seizing or claiming it. A speaking in brief, whose closures are only moments of transition, opening up to other possible moments of transition. These are forms of indirectness, well understood by anyone, in tune with poetic language. Every element constructed in a film refers to the world around it, while having at the same time a life of its own. And this life is precisely what is lacking when one uses word, image, or sound just as an instrument of thought. To say, therefore, that one prefers not to speak about, but rather to speak nearby, is a great challenge. Because actually, this is not just a technique or a statement to be made verbally. It is an attitude in life, a way of positioning oneself in relation to the world. And this is for the ones who didn't had the possibility to think about these words before, is Trinta Minha. It's a feminist theoretician and a filmmaker who I would like to propose and spiritually invite to join us. So thank you so much. I would love to hear if you have any other thoughts or questions or reflections. And yeah, Dina is probably getting because we should start with the film version.
Možemo u 8 krenuti s filmom, napravit ćemo malu pauzu, 10 minuta. Evo, ako neko još ima nešto zapitati Kumjanu, može ili sad ili evo, u pauzi.
I am halfway, by the way, with what I was planning to talk about.